I know I promised kittens, and I'm starting with a dog. It's a bit unfair, but then I looked at the description for the talk, and I must admit I wrote that quite a while ago, and I'm not going to fulfill all my promises, so I guess this is a good or bad start depending on your perspective on that. I prefer dogs, but don't worry, there will be plenty of these. As promised, that one I have to keep, I think. So I'm a long-time open source person. I mean, Mandrake, Linux, for those who remember that, and Mandriva and everything that came after when things fell apart and then fell apart again and again and again and again. Kept falling, but I've also used Debian and every other Linux distro under the sun, at least in the early 2000s. I've worked, well, I was very active in the KDE community, worked at OpenSUSE, worked at OwnCloud, and I'm a co-founder of Nextcloud, and that'll come back later. Just to check, how many of you know Nextcloud? All right, that's a fair bit of hands. Yeah, I was a little unsure how many of you expect me to talk about Nextcloud. The thing is, at this very same time, somebody else submitted a talk about Nextcloud. So actually, if you want to hear all about Nextcloud, you should just skedaddle and go to room 106, I think, because that's actually all about Nextcloud. That was a funny coincidence, because now there are kind of two, well, there's a bit of overlap, but not a ton, because I mostly talk about privacy rather than that. Oh, and the picture of the dog before that, that's my dog, or well, the dog of me and my wife. Her name is Popcorn, and she's absolutely awesome. I had pictures at our booth. You can come and look at them tomorrow if you want. All right, so, all right, yeah, this better? Sorry for that, I'll try. Whoa, there's a lot of applause there. All right, so, subject. I'm gonna talk about freedom, privacy, security, big tech, free software, open source. Gonna start a bit with the freedom and privacy thing, talk about, well, what's happening at the moment, open source freedom, a bit of license and law, and let me scroll, yeah, and at the end a little bit about alternatives and things that are out there. Honestly, if it's a little rambling, please ask questions if you're confused, because maybe I am too. And, you know, that can only help. So, when we were all young and beautiful, as I wrote in my notes, I started with this a while ago, clearly. We were kind of free, or at least, you know, we could do what we wanted on the internet. It was decentralized, it was beautiful. Email is still a little bit like that. I guess, consider it a bit of the Wild West. But at least, our files were on our own server, right? Or on our own computers, and those were the good times. At least, you know, we were kind of safe, right? We had control of our data, and, you know, things have changed a little bit, but, you know, all these people talking about surveillance, that was all kind of conspiracy, until, of course, you know, Snowden happened. And it turned out that the craziest conspiracy theories were still understating the reality of the amount of surveillance that was happening on the internet. Some people knew it, most people figured it out, and it was like, what happened? Yeah, what's happening? So let's talk a little bit about the cloud, about surveillance, about privacy, etc. So it turned out that even a president of the United States can be followed incredibly easy by random people on the internet by tracking the mobile phone of one of his agents. This was Donald Trump going around in Mar-a-Lago, just by, yes? Can't I really have to do it this way? I am so sorry. All right. Mea culpa. The previous room was that I gave a talk was a little smaller, and you know I could just yell at everybody. That worked easier. I hope this is better. All right. Where was it talking? Trump, all our favorite president. So it turned out it was very easy to follow where he was and where he was going by just looking at cell phone data, which turned out to be just on the internet in a corner somewhere. And of course Google, another fun incident that happened. Nest, home security cameras, really cool, cheap, and turned out they had a microphone in them as well, which, you know, was not being advertised or talked about. I think Google said that they failed to notify users there was a microphone in there, and yeah, they called that an oversight, a little error. Yeah, it's quite fascinating, these kind of mistakes. Another fun one that got in the news at some point is, this is a map of an overseas US military base, because sport trackers, you know, people would go running and, you know, in the base, and suddenly the whole layout of the base was just there on the website of the sports tracker company, and whoops. You know, so nobody was paying attention to all this stuff, right? And then, yeah, we figured out that this data was actually being stored, being used by the NSA and tons of other companies. But it's not just them, right? Tech companies themselves are also using this. So at some point, a pitch from Facebook to their customers, and that's not you, to be clear, that's companies, right, who want to advertise to you. You're the product. Sorry. A pitch from them came out. I think it was in Australia. And the pitch was just, it was pretty amazing. They basically said, look, you know, a nice example of how you can use Facebook to advertise to people is if you target teenagers. And then you target on words like worthless, insecure, stressed, etc. And those feelings, because we can measure when they're at their most vulnerable. So you can then advertise a product to them that they will buy. For example, I don't know, a leather jacket to feel cool or something. It's nice they're so upfront about it, you know, that you know that they are very explicitly trying to catch people at their weakest point, in this case, teenagers. I'm kind of happy that it leaked, because I think a lot of people were like, wait, what? But yeah, this is business, of course, right? And this is possible if you have this much data about people. I think a lot of people just don't realize what that data can do, which again became clear when I believe Target turned out to know when you're pregnant, sometimes even before the women themselves knew it, let alone their families. So Target would send free samples of products aimed at pregnant women to their home address, trying to get them to, you know, buy their products. But these women were just changing their shopping behavior, which is how Target knew they were pregnant, but they didn't know it yet. And their family didn't. And then you get suddenly advertising for this, and your husband is like, why are we getting this? Just imagine the conversations you get at that point, right? This is not healthy. Again, we're not really understanding what the scope of the problem is here, generally speaking. But it's pretty big. And businesses are getting a massive amount of control over, you know, what we do and where and how you sleep and the money you pay for it. It's like a tax that is very hard to avoid. I think of hotels and restaurants and stuff that you book. I mean, if you're a company and you're trying to, well, you're offering hotel rooms, you can't not be on these 3 websites. And you have to pay the tax that it costs to be on there. That there's no choice there. These companies are running the show. And they're using all their data that they know of customers to make sure, well, they extract the highest percentage of income between what we pay in an hotel and what the hotel gets, of course. A lot of this stuff is like maybe, again, a few more examples of where things went wrong a little bit. It's actually the second one, I think, that's the most nasty, because at some point it came out that Facebook was using the phone numbers that people gave for second factor authentication, of course, to target people. But like, I don't know, I don't think this is a surprise they did that, obviously. I think Myanmar is a bit of a crazy story. How many of you are familiar with the story of what happened in Myanmar? Right, so Myanmar suffered a genocide, or at least, well, the Rohingya minority group in Myanmar suffered a genocide, and most, yeah, what's the value of experts? But sorry? Can you say that again? Yes, it's a new name for Burma, exactly. Yeah, it's a country with a questionable state of democracy, which obviously is a problem of itself. But what happened there is that Facebook employs moderators on their networks, but they don't have as many moderators in every country as in, well, some other countries. And in Myanmar, they had, I don't know, 5 or maybe just plain 0. It's not really clear how many they had, if any, at the time. But what started to happen there is that a pattern developed where a lot of completely fake news about this minority group started to spread and get amplified to really crazy levels, up to the point where people started to attack this minority. And at some point, the army joined in, and they started to just burn down whole villages, and there's now, I think, 1.3 million Rohingya living in the next door country. And pretty much all experts would agree that none of that would probably have happened if it wasn't for Facebook. Just plain and simple. And that's just insane, I think. So all of these are all examples of things where, well, things went really wrong. And it all has to do with privacy and control, right? The amount of control we have over our own data. Now, privacy is a very personal thing. It's something we all need. And it's not just to prevent, genocides and stuff. It's because you need it as a person. It controls the impression that you make on others, as I wrote here so nicely. I mean, you care about how others see you. And this is what privacy is about. It's not that you have something to hide. And you often hear, like, I have nothing to hide. And this argument has very little to do with privacy. I mean, sure, you close the door on the toilet, not because what you do there is illegal. It's just none of any other's business. And this is fundamentally because you want to control how other people see you. You're a different person at work, at university, at home, with your family, on one side or the other. So, and these different personalities, they depend on you being able to separate how people see you and control how people see you. And this is a very fundamental human need. It's why you use makeup and take a bloody shower. I mean, it's also polite to do that, but it also has to do with how you're seen by other people. It's why you wear certain clothes, you wear a band t-shirt or a t-shirt of your favorite open source projects. These are things where you are trying to control how other people see you. And this requires your ability to control that. If everybody can see everything, this goes away and people start to behave different. There have been tons of interesting studies done where you see that if people are being surveilled, they act differently. You hang up a camera in the corner and you tell people it's on or it's off, and depending on what you told them, they act different. Of course, irrespective of whether a camera's on or off, because you can't know for sure. So, with all our data being controlled by a small number of, well, big companies, they can run our lives. They can have a ton of influence, right? So what can you do with this? If you know what people hear, what they see, what they talk about, if you know what they want, what they need, well, you can basically influence it. You might think advertisement doesn't influence me. Well, maybe not, but the opinions of your friends and family do. And how do you get the opinions of your friends and family? Well, a lot of that you get via Facebook. So if Facebook can control what you think your friends and family think, that'll influence what you think and what you do. We know this in politics, that most people's political opinion has a lot to do with the people they hang out with. I mean, it's not a big surprise. If you live in a red state, why is there a red state in the first place? It's because where people live controls what they hear, who they talk to, and that in turn has a lot of effect on their opinions on things. Facebook controls digitally where you live. They can control the timeline. I mean, do you know why something shows up in the recommended stream? You don't. And honestly, they don't really either, but they can control it and influence it. So this can do all kinds of things, right? Like China would use these kind of technologies and does use these kind of control technologies to, well, make their country or their citizens behave and be good communist citizens. Here, we're mostly using this at the moment to sell stuff, right? They say that many of the brilliant minds of our age are spending their time trying to make people click on ads, which is a very sad state of affair. It would be nice if we were doing something more productive. But the effect is impressive. And I find TikTok a fun example of the differences between these two approaches. So since March 1st, I believe, here in the US, TikTok introduced a limit on, what is it, a 60-minute default time limit per day for users under 18. That's new here, and that of course has a lot to do with a lot of, well, let's call it outrage about the amount of data TikTok has on its users and the amount of time teenagers spend on it. But in China, the Chinese TikTok has actually had this limitation since 2018. That's 5 years ago. The Chinese government has been on top of this way longer than, well, the government here. And they introduced tons of rules. They have parental controls, they've banned underage kids from appearing in live streams. I have a nice list here, believe me, it's a long list. 2019, they limited users in teenagers already to 40 minutes a day. So we're behind China in basically, well, allowing TikTok and such apps to control the lives of our families and kids, which I think is, that's pretty impressive. They are very much aware of this and the dangers that these things have. So what I'm saying is we need a bit of a plan. We need to look for ways to regain control over our data, over what's happening here. Now, first a note, I don't want to say that either government or business is the solution here. You know, in Europe we tend to think that government solves problems, while in the US people tend to think, by and large, that companies solve business problems. I think in reality both create as many problems as they solve. In Europe I usually use 2 slides to get the point across about government, because this was, back in the day, actually legal, and these people were criminals. So it's not always that legal rules and laws can fix problems like these. Yeah, as citizens, we also have to step up and care about these things. And that might include doing things that are illegal, because, you know, it's what they did. And that might help. And rules and government and oversight, you know, it can't really fix everything. Yeah? I mean, you have something to hide, you should have something to hide, and it's okay, you need something to hide. It's normal, it's a healthy state of affair. Yeah? The key point is, if privacy gets eroded, who gets hurt? It's not the government, because the government obviously, you know, they will keep their own privacy and keep data from the civilians if they want to. It's also not defense contractors or oil companies. It's not drug traffickers or, you know, big arms dealers. If you make laws about not being able to use encryption, it's not these companies who have a problem, because they can evade these laws, they have money for it. And government can evade the laws because they make the laws. It's also not well-funded terrorists, because again, they have the money. Laws that invade on our privacy by, for example, taking away encryption, they don't create problems for criminals. They create problems for normal citizens. They create problems for grassroots activists. And you see this, by the way, in China, where the government is, of course, not happy with grassroots activists. And if you dare protest once, the next time you try to get on a flight, you might be denied, because you're in a database somewhere and you might continue to be in the database. So for us to keep some degree of freedom, we need some degree of privacy. It's the journalists, the local charities that are annoying, that are the ones who are stopped by privacy. And it's not just evil government either. There's a pretty nasty example already quite some years ago, where in Mexico a doctor was killed for, well, tweeting bad things about a local drug gang. They managed to hack her account, figure out who it was, and, you know, the next tweet, I believe, showed her head, and, well, just that. And that was the end of the Twitter account as well as the doctor. So again, legal solutions can help. I do think we should push for privacy regulations. I think open source can help. I think open source licenses are helpful because it enforces a certain level of transparency. Open standards can help because again, it makes it easier to access data, to check, for example, big data. We can force governments to be transparent, that we know what they are doing, that they share the data that they have. We can analyze it, search it as a community, and for that open standards and open source software is helpful. That can help. Now it's the big picture here. But as I said, government, it's a two-edged sword. Like, yes, government can create privacy regulations. In Europe, we have the GDPR, which is really a pretty good, in my opinion, set of laws that protects people's privacy, puts them in control over the data. And if a company has your data in Europe, you can at any point in time go to the company and say, I want an overview of every piece of data you have on me. Any personal data, I want a copy. And you can ask them to delete it, and they have to. If they want to share it with a third-party company, let's say a marketing company, they have to ask you for permission. It has to be opt-in. This is good rules. At the same time, they are discussing in Europe how they can outlaw encryption because, you know, think of the children. It's the usual debate. Can you have encryption that law enforcement can break and can look at, while the rest of the world cannot? And no, you can't, right? It's a, well, talk to any encryption specialist here. If you make a backdoor, it'll be used as much, if not more, by the people you're trying to defend from as by law enforcement. Besides, the whole thing, I think, is not helpful. Giving more tools to law enforcement is not always the solution in this regard. I think I have an example of that later, but I'll get to it right now. In Germany, there was at some point, it's about a decade ago, a arsonist who had burned down over 100 cars. So obviously you can imagine they were getting very desperate to catch the person. So they started to monitor every cell phone in the capital. It was in Berlin. And so they monitored 4 million cell phones, and there are about 4 million people in Berlin. So basically they monitored the entire city for weeks. They did catch the arsonist, but it was because they saw him, not because they were surveilling everybody. Just as a comparison, this was to get one person in one city. They surveilled the entire city, 4 million people. In the 90s, it would be quite a thing if in Germany, over a whole year, 700 phones were tapped. So we're escalating here a little, to put it mildly. This is the direction government is taking it. So again, I'm not saying it's a solution. It can be part of it. We need to push our government for privacy regulations, but we also need to push back on stuff like, oh, let's get rid of encryption, because, you know, we can't read everybody's text. You shouldn't be able to. Yeah, that's a problem. Now, licenses is a similar story. We have a ton of challenges here with licenses. I don't think you can fix privacy problems with open source licensing. Yeah, and honestly, I think we have other problems at the moment. I think we're all aware, or most of us must be aware, what's happening with AI at the moment. The licensing issues that we have with the AI models being developed right now and the data and where it's coming from, I think that's a big enough problem to deal with, and I don't think privacy can be dealt with in licensing. So, well, I think one thing I like is antitrust, because I think a big part of the problem is centralization of data. Now, obviously, I am rather, how do you say that, biased. I believe in decentralization. I think it's a better solution in general, and I'll get to that later. But in any case, the big picture is, yes, privacy regulation can help. Licenses, there are some things open source can help. I think open source, open data, open standards. And finally, I think, yes, that there is room for antitrust. Yeah? But these are things that are, well, I gave another presentation already about antitrust and privacy regulation. So, well, you can, I suppose, watch the video on that one. I want to talk a little bit about like more technical things, because I mean, we're nerdy people here. We build technology at this conference. And so let's get out of our caves for a few seconds and talk about, you know, what kind of stuff you need to solve problems. So the first thing I think we need is control, right? The point of privacy is that you control what happens with your data. And as I said, kind of the GDPR and says this has to be the case, but I would like technology to enforce it, because if you see how hard big tech is fighting these privacy regulations, it's pretty impressive. And they can throw a lot of money and time at it. So in practice, it's not working as nice as it should. Of course, we need security. I think we need trust. I think it needs to be easy to use. And of course, it needs to be able to do what we need it to do. Now, actually, I wanted to ask if stuff is missing here, because I think there's I think there's probably more to this list. You know, solutions. What are requirements for a solution to protect our privacy? I perhaps should have asked before putting in my own list, because that limits the discussion a bit. But if anybody has any other thoughts or things that are missing, then please shoot. I'd love to, well, at least improve my presentation for the next time. All right. I have some more thoughts, so let me share those then instead. Because I already raved about federation and about decentralization a few times, and I think that this is one of the key things that we need in our technology today. I know I'm not going to talk about blockchain and this stuff because, well, distributed databases already existed. I'm not a big fan of the buzzword there, but I do think federation of data and decentralization with open communication protocols, I think, is really key to solving these problems. So people running their own server, BitTorrent-like protocols, open source, and openness. Because in the end, if you don't have a couple of big companies controlling everything, you have a lot more control already, because you can walk away and the free market can do its things. Of course, it still needs to be easy to use, it needs to be capable, it needs to be good technology, right? But at least with decentralization, we get the kind of protection that you see, you know, even in real life, right? If you protect stuff in your house, you should put a good lock on it, you should keep it out of sight, but you should also not keep everything in one place. If there is a, I don't know, a break-in in the neighborhood, you know, once they've broken into 2 houses, everybody else knows, and they're going to protect and hide their stuff a lot better. While if there's only one place to break into, first of all, well, they're going to spend all their time trying to break into that one place, and they will get in, because security is a losing game in that regard. There's no perfect security ever. Well, and second of all, once they break in, everything is gone. Yeah. So I really think decentralization is a better solution here. Anyhow, so, and there's a nice quote here, because again, right, if you go to this point of like, we need less encryption, this is what governments sometimes want, they want to be able to see what we're doing, then you come back to the point of like the NSA and organizations like that. They had found flaws in a variety of encryption technologies, and instead of fixing them, they were using them to surveil people. That's nice, perhaps for the NSA, but of course these flaws were also used by other people to surveil the same people. So they made us all less safe. And this continues to be something that gets pushed. If you decrease security for everyone, you create a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, it's like saying, let's not lock the doors, because if a burglary were in progress, it would be good if the police can get in the house. Yeah, that's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy there, right? You're creating the problem. There's one infrastructure in the world, and you don't get to create a world where the US gets to spy on everyone, but the Chinese can't. If you make a technology that lets the US government or the German government or the French government spy on their citizens, then the Russians and the Iranians and the Chinese and whoever else you think is scary will be using that very same technology to spy on your citizens too. This is just how technology works, right? It doesn't check who's behind the keyboard. So, well, let me pitch, well, a couple of solutions actually, not just one. I mean, I want to talk a little bit about what we're building at Nextcloud, but I also want to point to a ton of other alternatives. I was just looking for a couple of websites that offer alternatives. I really like open source Alternative 2. It's better than Alternative 2 because, you know, it's open source, which is always a plus. There's restoreprivacy.com, but there are a ton of websites like these, and I did not want to try and make an exhaustive list. And there you will find things like Mastodon, you know, to replace Twitter, PeerTube to replace YouTube. A lot of you, well, you're walking around, there's an open source conference. I think every third booth you will find alternatives to, you know, big tech solutions. So I don't need to go over the entire list here. But the point is there are technologies that we have built that do fulfill these requirements of control, being able to run it yourself, being able to, you know, have decentralized federated systems. How many of you are aware of Mastodon? How many of you are on Mastodon? Well, let's first ask who know it. That's way too few, seriously, people. So Mastodon does the same thing as Twitter does, in the sense that you can sign up for an account, you get you can follow people, you get a stream of their thoughts and brain farts and whatever they came up with in the last week, or minute or hour. Except Mastodon is just a piece of software. So anybody can download that software, run it on the server, and then people can join the server and then follow each other on the server. Now you think, well, that's nice, but the whole point of Twitter is that I get to follow interesting people like, I don't know, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and he's not going to be on every one of these little servers. Now, is he? No, he's not, but he doesn't have to be, because the cool thing is it's federated. You can be on Gmail and send an email to Outlook, right? Well, you can be on one Mastodon server and follow somebody on another Mastodon server. It's all one big network. And yet all the servers are individually owned by usually individual people, small groups of people, charitable organizations, or even companies who use it internally. And each of these servers can even have their own rules, because you can say, hey, you know, but there is the moderation, there is all the, well, bad stuff that comes out from Twitter, and I know it's a rage machine and it's not cool. True. On Mastodon, you can find a server that has a nice environment that fits with, well, what you think limits the rage a little bit. Let me put it that way. That's personally what I'm looking for, because I just get so pissed off scrolling on Twitter for a while. And it's really nice. So these individual servers, they can put their own filters, they can put their own rules, they can exclude other servers and create a nicer environment there. And this is, I know, technically it's not simple, of course. It was a ton of work to build this. But it's an open protocol. We use it in Nextcloud as well. We support it. It's well documented. You don't need to use Mastodon to be able to join this network. You can use a Nextcloud server. I'll get to that a bit later. There are other technologies that can interact with it. And PeerTube, which is like a YouTube replacement, is actually built on the same technology. So PeerTube, Mastodon, they federate with each other. So these things are decentralized. They're disconnected in a way maybe from the big world, but they are together creating an alternative universe of decentralized and free and open source, privacy respecting, you know, technologies. And there's a ton of this stuff out there. Again, if you have Twitter, seriously, look at Mastodon, try to move over. There's a couple of services that will automatically forward your tweets from Twitter to Mastodon. And the other way around, so you can migrate slowly, and a ton of cool people have already moved to Mastodon, so there's really no reason not to do that. And this is true for lots of other technologies too. You don't have to have your email at Google or Outlook. There are other providers that offer email. And it might cost a couple of bucks a month in some cases, because, you know, if they're not selling you as a product to their advertisers, they have to make money in a different way. But they do exist. ProtonMail is a nice example, and honestly, there are tons of others, which is really good. So I'm going to talk about one of them, because, you know, I do have this T-shirt, and I have to do it some justice. But don't think it's the only solution out there, and I also don't want to advocate it's the only solution. Also because, of course, Nextcloud does not do everything under the sun, even though we do a ton. So let's get to Nextcloud. That's one thing that we built in a way to try and deal with this whole, well, problem that I've been talking about for the last 30 minutes. It's an open source platform. It does tick the boxes, of course. It's open source. You are in control. You can do with it whatever the heck you want, including things that I wouldn't approve of, which is fine. That's part of the open source deal. It's federated. You can run an Xcloud server at home. Your parents can have one. Your friends can have one. And you can share files between all of you without problems. They can connect, share their user directories, but the files will stay on your server. You stay in control. If you share the file with your family, they can view it, they can work on it, they can do with it what they want until you remove the share, then they can't access it anymore. It's easy to use, at least I'd like to think it is. I'll show a couple of nice screenshots later. And it does a ton of the stuff that the big tech companies do. And so the thing that we are going after as Nextcloud, it's a collaboration platform. So it's to share files, sync them between your desktop, your laptop, your mobile phone, etc. Video calls, chat. Well, I'll walk through it a little bit. So it's a dashboard where you can see your calendar and talk chats, things like that. Upcoming tasks, which is all red. That's bad. So file share, not that complicated. It's just like Dropbox does it, but this stays on your own server. You can run it on a Raspberry Pi. You can run it in a virtual private server. You can run it, I don't know, on an old laptop. I use an old desktop that I put in a storage closet, and that runs around Nextcloud. It has tons of, like, I don't know, fancy or not fancy features. You have a nice thing where you can put comments on folders on top, but that's rather nerdy. We have apps for Android, iOS, Windows, Mac, and Linux. Of course, you have to support Linux. Most of our people in the company run Linux, even though I'm here with a MacBook, I know. But I have a Linux system at home, which I use as my primary driver. These things just have such lovely battery life. It has kind of Slack-like thing built in, or Microsoft Teams replacement. It depends on how you look at it, but it does pretty much the things that they do. But again, the chat logs, the whole thing, it stays in your own server. Yeah, you don't need to hand things over just because you want to be able to chat with other people. You can invite other people to this with a public link, so you don't need to give them an account either. They can just join with a link, which is nice as well, I think. And it has, like, I don't know, the locations, and you can share GIFs and, you know, all the fun stuff. And video calls, of course. 3 of these are employees of us. So either we're incredibly pretty or, you know, because the other 3 are stock photos, because, you know, I always find it fun to see which one people think are team members of us. Anyhow, there's a mail client, but it's not a mail server. So as I said, there are tons of other projects. Find a nice project where you can host your email. There's ProtonMail, there are others as well. Running your own mail server, I actually don't recommend, because I said mail is nicely federated. It is as a protocol, unfortunately, because there are like 5 big email companies where everybody has their email these days. It's actually getting really hard to run your own mail server. This is a pain in the ass. And I think that's really sad. Friend of mine is running a project trying to change that. I really hate myself because this is the second time I want to talk about him and I don't remember the name of it. I'll try and put it up somewhere later if I think of it. But there are some people who are worried about this too and trying to build like solutions that make it easy to host your email as well. There's a calendar that does work just fine. It syncs to your Android and your iPhone and stuff like that, and you can, you know, accept and decline. And contact app where you can make these nice organization charts in it as well. And we have an office that's integrated. This is based on LibreOffice, as many of you probably know, a free office suite for your desktop. But it is in the browser and collaborative, so you can edit your documents with multiple people at the same time. It's really nice. We have a kind of a wiki built in, knowledge management, nice for companies. Deck, which is a Kanban board. Photos, this is actually really good stuff. And if you think that like running stuff on your own server means you can't have fancy AI things, think again. We managed to build in on-premise neural network that can recognize faces, put names to them. It can recognize objects and make them easy to search for. So yes, also with Nextcloud, without your pictures having been sent anywhere else, you can ask for all the pictures of airplanes. I don't know how many pictures you take of airplanes, but you can ask for it either way. I do recommend Kittens actually, because that's much more nice, but also works. And as I mentioned, it's available on tons of devices. And the easy part is easy to install. So that's just Nextcloud. But as I said, there are tons of other solutions out there. And there's Mattermost, they are here. Bunch of other projects. So go and have a look and talk to them and try and figure out how you can get away from the big companies and protect your privacy. Are there questions, comments, complaints? Another point. I have Kitty image credits, another picture of the dog. Yes? Backups. Mm-hmm. True, true. Yeah, this is a tricky one. I mean, I can answer for Nextcloud what we've done, because we built a backup app where you can just make a deal with somebody else with a Nextcloud instance, and you get like 5 GB on their instance, they get 5 GB of yours, and then you back up to their instance. So if your house burns down, your data is on the other server and the other way around. Just don't have both your houses burned down. This doesn't solve the problem, of course, for mail or anything else. So yeah, so the problem with a lot of this is indeed you get more responsibility with it as well, and I think that's a really good point. However, I'm not saying we all need to run our own server, right? I was just advocating for run your own Nextcloud, but you don't have to. There are tons of companies that do it, and you can even run it on AWS. And then you say, oh, but now we're back at big tech. Yes, that is true, but the problem is not necessarily that there are big companies. The problem is that almost everybody is at the big companies, and they have a huge vendor lock-in. The problem is not hosting online. The problem is not that somebody else has access to your data in itself, as long as it's not 3 big companies, right? It's all our eggs in one basket. That's the problem here. I'm talking about decentralization. I totally would be worried if I was fully responsible for backups of all my data. I am not a great sysadmin at all. I'm terrible at it, actually. Our instance of Nextcloud is down every 3 months, because the Let's Encrypt certificate has expired again, and I haven't figured out yet how to automate renewing it. And that's terrible, but you know, the thing is, there are tons of companies that host for you. I pointed to Proton Mail, because you don't need to run your own mail server. Nextcloud, there are literally hundreds of companies that are hosting Nextcloud. You can probably find one in your city maybe, or at least state. So that means that you know in what data center your data is. You can go there, you can look them in the eye and see whether you trust them to host your data. I think that makes a huge difference. Plus, there's still a professional who's running backups over your data. And it's not all in one place. There's a real solution in that regard there. We just need to make sure that that software exists. And yes, Nextcloud is nice, and it's one of those. But all the other projects also need support and need to be used and need to get resources to keep getting better. Like Mastodon, for example. Other questions? I hope it answers the question. Nobody else? Well, then you're all free. School's out. Have a nice one. Thank you.